Hello, everyone, and welcome to VENN number 10, which is, do you really need a survey? I'm excited today to have two of my colleagues at the City of New Westminster. Jennifer Miller is our Manager of Public Engagement, and Zaria Alibhai is our Public Engagement Coordinator and happens to be my office mate at City Hall. We're here today to talk about this awesome topic regarding surveys, and I couldn't be more excited to be getting into it. I would like to acknowledge first and respect that New Westminster is on the unceded and unsurrendered land of the Halkomelem speaking people. We acknowledge at the city that colonialism has made invisible their histories and connections to the land. And as a city, and me personally, we're learning and building relationships with the people whose land we're on. With that, I'm going to invite Jennifer and Zaria to take it away. If you have questions during this, you're welcome to put them in the chat. We will read them out loud so that people who are watching this recording later are able to see what the questions are. And I guess I didn't introduce myself. So my name's Jen Arbo, and I work in economic development. And one of my roles is to try and support our nonprofit community here at the city. So take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the intro, Jen, and welcome. And hello to those of you who are watching the recording later on. So as Jen mentioned, my name is Jennifer, and I work in public engagement at the city along with Zaria. And we are a small but mighty team of two. And I just wanted to start by telling you a little bit about the work that we do at the city and what our role is. So basically, we support all city departments, so across the organization, in doing their public engagement work. So we actually work with surveys a lot, and we do a lot of surveying at the city. But what we wanted to talk to you tonight about is maybe just questioning whether you need a survey, or if there's some other engagement technique that might work better for you than a survey. And then we will share some of our best tips and tricks that we've learned over our time doing surveying and whatnot at the city. So I am just going to get my screen up here, and I think I've actually got the wrong window up. Let me know if this is as expected.
It is now. Looks good.
Okay, awesome. So do you need a survey? We're going to make the case for some alternatives, but if you insist, we will share our best survey tips and tricks. So one of the reasons why we've framed our session this way is because we think we're kind of over surveyed as a general rule in society, and we're part of that too. We do, as I said, we do a lot of surveys at the city, and I don't think we'll ever stop doing surveys. But there's a lot of surveys coming our way all the time from all different kinds of organizations and companies and corporations all the time. So this is a busy space, online surveys. And you're competing, when you do a survey, you're competing for everyone's attention with a lot of survey requests coming their way. So, I think we see a lot of surveys in our lives. So if we can encourage you to take a little bit of a step back, think about what you're trying to achieve with your survey, and then maybe, explore if there might be some other option or some other activity you can do to get the input or the feedback you're looking for from your community, from your donors, from your stakeholders, that there might be some other tool out there that might work better for you than a survey.
Thanks, Jennifer, and hi, everyone watching presently and in the future. For today's session on all things survey related, we have 4 main topics that we're going to talk about. First, we'll start by covering the pros and cons of using a survey as a way to gather input. Then we'll take a look at some of the alternatives to a survey. And then if you're still convinced that a survey is the way you want to go, we'll cover some of our few top tips and tricks to make sure that your survey is super effective. And then finally, before we wrap up and take some questions, we'll look at some examples of survey questions that are well done and some that perhaps might need some improvement. And we'll talk you through some of the ways on how those can be made a little bit better. And we're hoping that this conversation and this presentation today is going to be a bit casual and informal. So at any point in time, if you have any questions or any thoughts for us, Jen, yourself included, please jump in and interrupt us. We're happy to take questions as we go, and you don't have to wait till the end. So with that, let's get into the survey pros and cons. Next slide, please. So here in our Venn diagram, we have a list of some of the pros or the YAAAAS aspects of a survey. And these are some of the reasons that we believe surveys get used so often, to the point, as Jennifer mentioned, where they're almost overdone now. So first that we have, a survey is a very safe option. You know, there's minimal risk to you and your organization or your process if you launch a survey. With a survey, you ask a very specific set of questions, and then you get a very specific set of responses back. And there are very few unknowns here, which makes it feel quite comfortable. You know what to expect when you conduct a survey, and that's a pro. Surveys are also very quick for participants. You know, people are able to do them on their own time. They often can just take place online and take less than 10 minutes to complete in most cases. And that tends to result in a pretty good response rate. Surveys are also cheap. You don't need any fancy equipment or budget to conduct a survey. And nowadays there's so many free survey platforms online that the cost of administering a survey really just comes down to staff time, which is a huge incentive for a lot of organizations. And then the last reason is that a survey is easy. And now I have easy in quotation marks here because yes, the above reasons do make it feel like a survey is easy, but I think that's often a misconception that we see. Creating a survey is actually quite involved, and it requires a fair amount of skill and attention and time to really nail down right. And people confuse this sense of ease with their level of comfort with a survey, in that it's an easy decision to make. You know, it's easy to choose to conduct a survey because it feels safe and it's familiar and it's cheap. And we see that kind of train of thinking becoming the default. You don't need to go up to your boss and convince them that a survey is the best option to use to gather input. It's not any radical idea, and that makes it really attractive. So I would argue that a survey is not easy, but it's an easy decision to make. And cons. My survey red flags, if you will. First and foremost, surveys are boring. Long surveys can sometimes feel like homework assignments or a quiz that can really be unappealing to a lot of people and could result in a low response rate. And then again, surveys are overdone and people are tired of sharing their thoughts through form. And this also kind of relates to the next point, where that a survey only allows for one-way dialogue. And we sometimes imagine that image of a person yelling through their computer screen at you, and there is no opportunity for that two-way exchange of dialogue. And there isn't an opportunity for those who are responding to your survey to even interact with other people who may be sharing similar thoughts. And that kind of contributes to a survey feeling very transactional, in that you parachute in, you collect some data, and then you parachute out. So there's no opportunity for relationship building with those who are sharing their feedback with you, or the opportunity to build a lasting connection with a survey. And then last con that I've kind of come up with, but I'm sure there are many more out there, is that a survey creates a line in the sand, meaning that you can only collect feedback on what you're asking for. So a survey doesn't provide an opportunity for other types or color commentary, and that can really be a limiting factor in your decision.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Zaria, for those pros and cons, and we're sure there's more, so happy to hear any other pros or cons you might want to share in the chat, and we'll read those out if any come to mind. So I'm going to share just a few ideas for what else you can do. So if you're not going to do a survey, and we would encourage you to consider something other than a survey instead of just defaulting to always doing an online survey. What else can you do? And we know cost is something that needs to be considered. So before we start getting into some alternative tools, we just wanted to share this quote from Maslow, who is of course famous for his hierarchy of needs. But if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. So your survey is definitely the hammer here in this analogy. And we're, applying it to everything we're doing. And, it might not be the best tool for your situation. An example here, even just connecting it over to the hierarchy of needs. If you think about a college student who's looking to maximize their energy or attention in class, their hammer or a go-to tool, their equivalent of a survey might be caffeine, but they're not considering some other tools like getting better sleep, improving their diet, maybe doing some exercise to help maximize their energy levels. So just thinking about, there are lots of other tools out there to receive input from your community, from your donors and your stakeholders. So here's a couple to consider. So the first one to kind of pitch out to you is a social poll. And I know this is going to feel a lot like a survey, and it looks a lot like a survey, but it's different in some really key ways. So if you do a poll on one of your social channels, you're catching people where they already are. And that's one of the biggest tips we hear about in engagement all the time is reach people where they already are. Don't ask them to come to you. So when you're asking someone to fill out an online survey, they need to click on a link, they need to go to an external platform, you're taking them somewhere else. If you're doing a poll on social, it's a place they're already hanging out, and all they have to do is click or tap their screen in order to participate in your question. They don't have to go somewhere else. It can be really quick and fast for them to participate. A poll also forces you to drill down to just one question. So one of the things we're going to talk about later is like making your survey as short as possible, being really ruthless about cutting out questions that you don't really need to ask. And I think a poll really pushes you to do that as well. So like, let's say you want to ask about, should we do a specific fundraiser again? That's one question. You don't need a whole set of survey questions, 10+ questions to get down to that one piece of input that you're looking for from your community. You can drill it down to just one question. People can answer really quickly and then move on with their lives. And then you have quick input as well to action and consider in your work.
One of the other things I'd add, Jennifer, is that with the social polls, the beauty of them is that people can add comments, they can reply, and they can expand if they want to expand. So it gives you the opportunity to, put the onus on them if they're feeling compelled or they have lots they want to say without you just sort of seeking, sort of boilerplate responses. So I love social polls for that reason as well.
Yeah, I love that addition, and it connects with my kind of last pro thing to promote for a social poll is that it's more interactive, right? It gets a little bit more of that dialogue. So someone can comment, someone else can comment on their comment. There's some polls allow participants to add another option, like a Facebook poll allows you to do that. And so it's a bit more of a conversation. People can see the results in real time. And it's not this one way where you're collecting all that input and nobody else is seeing what others have to say. So all of the main social platforms offer some version of polling, so something to consider as an alternative, or something to do in, maybe if you usually do 3 surveys a year, maybe one of those 3 could be a poll instead, and really just getting one question out there. The other, another tool or technique for engagement that I'd like to suggest to you is interviews. These, I've used these really a lot in my career in engagement, and even before that when I used to work as a newspaper reporter. So I think I'm biased towards interviews as a way to hear from people. But what I really like about this is that, you can have a 30-minute conversation with someone and get a ton of really rich input, and have a lot really to work with. And so, interviews as well, I think you don't need to do a ton of them to get some diverse input. So if you think about, how many people are participating when you do an online survey, it shouldn't be a numbers game. It shouldn't be about how many people did we reach. If you did 10 interviews, you would probably end up with a lot more rich input and diverse input than you would from 50 or 100 survey responses that are quite surface level and a lot of multiple choice. So for interviews, I would recommend you create a set list of questions and you ask all of those same questions to each of your interviewees. It's best practice for this type of interview to share the questions in advance so that your interviewees can prepare. Also think about who you're interviewing. So if you want to do 10 interviews, you want to think about diverse perspectives, people from different groups, people from different demographic backgrounds, from different parts of your community, so that you can get those different perspectives and kind of get a bit of a robust viewpoint across all of those conversations. So interviews, and this is really low cost, right? You can do it over the phone. It doesn't need to take a ton of time for you or your participants. And the last kind of option I'll sort of throw out there or pitch is some other online tools, such as Mural. Mural is a free one and one that we've used and that is really flexible, and you can use it in all kinds of different ways. Mural is an online space where there is some pre-work on your side where you need to set up kind of a brainstorming board, or you set up the parameters of what you're asking from your community, but then people can go in and participate in all kinds of different ways. So you can do these online sticky notes and like this brainstorming board. People can like vote on each other's ideas. There's all kinds of different tools that you can build in and customize on a mural board that then your community can go in and kind of participate in the ways that work for them. It's a lot more creative and open-ended than a survey, but it's still that online asynchronous space where people can participate on their own time, and they could even come back and look later on to see if some other people have commented, and then they can participate more. So again, it's more of that conversation. It's less constrained than a survey, but has a lot of those same benefits of being low cost, online, and asynchronous. So
I have
definitely
a question, Jennifer.
Yeah, for sure.
Is it the type of tool that a person has to create an account with to participate? So if they're going to give you feedback, they have to have an account with Mural?
No, they definitely don't. So there, you can provide a link where people can go in as a guest. I haven't, Zaria, maybe remind me if you might need to give your first name. I think you can have it pretty open where you definitely don't have to give an email address. Is that
that's great.
I think that's correct. I think you just need to have like create yourself a username or some identifier to go by within the Mural board. Yeah.
Great. Cool.
Yeah. So I think like tools like this are really customizable too. So like if for some reason you really wanted people to share their email address, I think that's a setting that you can set up on the setup side of things. But yeah, you can have this very open so that anyone who has a link can participate without having to sign up for an account. So definitely some a little more tech savvy is required for something like this, but it can be a really good online tool. All right, so if you're interested in exploring some other engagement techniques or methods, here's some search terms that you can just Google, and you should get these lists. So there are literally hundreds of different activities and techniques for getting feedback or input from your community. And these are some lists and some just information on what these things are and how to apply them and how to do them. And some of these lists even have like pros and cons that you can look at too. So these are like charts that show just different tools. So lots to explore here. So I encourage you, if those other alternatives are not appealing, but you want to kind of explore, these are some good resources to check out. So I wanted to kind of pause here. This is sort of our first half of the session where we're talking about pros and cons of surveys and things to step back and really consider before you decide to do a survey. And we talked about some alternatives. So, before we start moving into survey tips and design, are there any questions is this resonating? Are you open to considering something other than a survey, or maybe exploring some other tools? So we just wanted to pause here and for any kind of questions or discussion.
Yeah, I've got a question. I'm curious a little bit if you can comment on how to make surveys, and maybe we'll get to this in the second half, so maybe I'm stealing some of your excitement, but I'm just wondering about how to make this kind of evaluation more accessible, especially if the demographic or the group that you're trying to get feedback from, perhaps English is, not their first language, or perhaps you're working with someone who's neurodivergent. I'm just looking for some accessibility tips.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question, Jen, and it's not something that we're covering later on. So yeah, especially when we rely so much on online surveys, it's really good to also step back and consider, if someone is not super tech savvy, or maybe they're not even, online or have a computer or a device, how are they able to participate, and what options do they have? So I would definitely say, we want to offer some offline or offline alternatives. Something that we've done in the past is, offer to walk people through an online survey over the phone. That's always an option. Offer a phone call for sure. Offer a meeting in person, just a conversation as an alternative. And maybe I'll ask Zaria for some other thoughts and ideas on that accessibility piece.
Yeah, I think if you're hosting an online survey, I think just doing an accessibility check with like one of the screen reader testers, or doing kind of like a plain language review using something like Hemingway's, which is an online tool that kind of gives an indication of reading level to ensure that the content you're presenting is accessible in terms of understanding and comprehension. Those are some good tips. And if you're using images, always like include an alternative text or a caption that can help those who are visually impaired or use screen reader or other kind of aid devices to be able to get the full gist of your survey without being able to see the images.
Mm-hmm.
Have either of you found much success with promoted surveys? I know in the past I've worked with some nonprofits that have spent money, like, getting Facebook promoted posts or what have you. And what happened is their survey got back a lot of somewhat irrelevant responses from folks, because it just sort of advertised it to people, and it was those who were compelled to click that filled it out. So I'm just wondering if you've got any ideas for how to promote your survey in a way that's still kind of genuine and authentic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen that same phenomenon happen as well with surveys when we do boosted posts on social, or mainly through social media advertising, that it ends up being folks who are not that connected or passionate about the subject matter, and so it doesn't typically result in a lot of meaningful engagement. You can get your numbers up there, but again, it's not a numbers game, right? It's about the quality of the input versus the number of people who have eyes on your stuff. So in terms of promoting surveys, if you can offer an incentive, that sometimes helps. So keeping it within your sort of usual community and usual channels of communication, but maybe offering a little bit of an incentive, a prize draw, or some other, incentive to participate. We've seen some decent luck with prize draws for sure, especially if it's a prize that resonates with your audience and your community. Yeah, any other thoughts there, Zaria?
Yeah, I think if it's something that you're promoting widely, another option is to always include some sort of like qualifying question in advance. So sometimes we ask about people's connections to New West if we're hosting a public survey, and we list some options, things like resident, or I'm a student in New West, I work in New West, things like that. So that can help you see, I guess, where the bulk of your responses are coming from, and how connected they are to your question or your survey or your organization even, and that can help you kind of sort through the responses that you get.
Yep, for sure. And if it's important to you that only a specific group of people are responding, like you want only people who are connected to New West in some way, or there's some other group that you're trying to reach, you can have, you can set up your survey so that that's the first question. And if they say, no, I'm not connected to New West in any way, then you can say thanks, and terminate the survey for those folks and say thanks, but this survey is specific to people who have a connection here, or whatever that qualifier is for you.
Great.
Thanks for the questions, Jen. So now let's look at some of our top survey tips for going about creating and crafting a survey. Thank you. So tip number one actually comes into play before you even start creating your survey or crafting any questions. And your first step should really be to get crystal clear on your purpose. Before you decide on what questions you ask or what platform you want to host a survey or how long your survey should be, you should start by asking yourself, what is the decision or the topic that we're looking to get input on? And you really have to nail this down and really question how you will use the feedback and the input that you are collecting. And I think this is super, super important to do in advance of even putting your pen down on paper and thinking about a question to avoid this situation right here. And you never want to be in a position where you've created a survey, you've gotten all this great input, people have taken the time to share their thoughts with you, and then your feedback is essentially useless because what you're trying to actually do or implement can actually be completed with the feedback that you received. So having a crystal clear purpose sets the tone and the direction for everything else that follows with your survey.
All right, next tip here is keep it as short as possible. The advice I always give to our project teams here at the city is like 5 minutes or less if you can. I know that's really challenging, and I think we all kind of get into this space of like, well, we're asking these, we're creating a survey, we're asking them, we have them here, we have this audience here answering our survey, so let's also ask about this and let's also ask about that. Really try not to go there. Refrain from just throwing everything into the soup, right? You need to get that clear purpose for your survey and then really ask those key questions and keep it to those key questions that you really need and that you really know what you're going to do with when you get the answers. You know what you're going to do with the answers. So keep it as short as possible. And you want to always put in your survey intro or in your promotion that it's a 3-question survey or it's going to take 5 minutes. If people know that it's quick, you got to be honest about that it has to be quick. If you say it's going to be quick, it needs to be quick. If you say it's going to be quick, that's also going to motivate them to click and to respond. So keep it as short as possible and be ruthless about cutting questions that you don't need to ask in this survey.
Tip number 3, and this actually connects really well to tip number 2, and that's to work with at least one other person to review and create your survey. Collaborating with someone on your question design and having them bring that critical eye and sort of that interrogation lens to your survey is really helpful because sometimes we're so focused on our content and what we want to hear, we forget to look a little bit broader and really ask if these questions are necessary or if we're already asking this type of question in another way in our survey. So having someone who's a bit external to your content is really helpful because they can do that review and help you check to make sure what you're asking about makes sense and if they understand the language that you're using, does your survey flow. And then once you kind of have your question set put together, they can be your tester and really make sure that the logic in your survey is flowing and the survey functions in a sequential way and the way that you intend it to.
Our tip number 4 is to try to make it fun. So this kind of connects back to all the surveys that are coming our way all the time. It connects to making it quick as well. Try to make it fun. So, if you can add some images, if you can add some graphics, we're going to show you an emoji scale question a little bit later. Anything to kind of change it up from the usual, the usual that we see in surveys all the time, kind of, anything you can swap out for text. And as I said before, maybe a prize draw, anything to kind of, make it a little bit fresh, a little bit different. trying to make it a little bit fun for people to participate.
Tip 5 is to focus on multiple choice questions and not open-ended text boxes. So there are a couple of reasons for this, but primarily it's to protect yourself as a survey creator or administrator from having to analyze or summarize, review all this open-end content once your survey closes. So say if you have, five open-ended questions in your survey and you get 100 responses, that's 500 pieces of open-ended text that you have to read over, that you have to go through and try to make sense of. And that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. So having a multiple choice question makes it easier for you, but it also helps the participants, who are not trying to start from scratch to come up with a response to your question. You're providing them with some suggestions that can help them think down the right path. And then you can always, add on a smaller open-ended piece, like an other please specify option, or ask a follow-up question to probe as to why they selected a certain option. And that can help add a little bit of color to their multiple choice response, but you're not burdened then with going through paragraphs and paragraphs of text that came in through several open-ended questions in your survey.
All right. And our sixth and final top tip, using a survey to communicate or share information. So of course, often our main objective with a survey is to get input. We want to ask questions, but a survey can also work really well to share bits of information. And the way that it's structured with question is a way to kind of chunk out information or sort of give it in bite-sized pieces to help educate your community, to educate your survey takers and share some information. So the other thing that's important to keep in mind with this is that people need information in order to participate. So often, you're going to need maybe a paragraph or even a couple sentences of context to help people then answer the question that you're asking in your survey. So you always want to make sure you're thinking, do people have enough context and information to answer this question? Or do they first need to read a little bit of text or maybe see an image or maybe have a graphic? So I have an example here from a recent survey that we did at the city. And this one was, quite complex. So I think we did a decent job of chunking out the information. So this is a transportation survey where we were asking people about a route for a new active transportation corridor. And so here in the first, it's not the first question in the survey, but in this section, we've given a bit of preamble. So you see here's a text description about the route and the different options. And then there's a map. So we're sharing information in words, but then also in images or graphics. And then we say, before considering some of the key considerations and trade-offs, which we're going to get to next, what's your initial preference here? So we've shared a little bit of information, asked for preference, and then this is just a section of the detailed graphic we had next that talks about key considerations and trade-offs for each of these different routes. So this is pretty complex information. So, it does require some reading, but we've tried to do it in a graphic way. Then we dig in a little bit deeper and say, after you've considered this detail, then what's your level of support for each of these different options? And we've asked about them each individually. So this is an example of chunking out some information sharing and then interspersing that with survey questions. So that's a way to, and a demonstration of that sharing, using your survey to share information as well. All right. So those are our top tips for your survey design. And now we're going to dig into some example questions for you. And what we've done here is we've kind of started with some questions that, need some improvement, that maybe, it's questions that we see really often and they're very common in a lot of surveys, but there's, they're problematic or they could use some improvement in some way. So we're going to kind of start with an example that needs work and then show you how you might improve these question types.
So for our first example here, we have a multiple choice type question, that's a checkbox multiple choice. That's indicating kind of like a select all type question. And so this question asks, when are you likely to attend fundraisers? Select all that apply. And respondents here had the option to choose from 5 set options or provide their own response in another please specify field. So for our audience, for Jen perhaps, is there anything from this question that kind of stands out to you? Any areas that you think could use improvement?
Yeah, so I feel like I've seen this question, but I feel like the problem here is that the data you're going to get back is really weak because they'll choose probably everything. And also it's so situational. Like this type of question is like, when are you likely to attend a fundraiser? Well, I'm likely to find space in my calendar depending upon how important it is to me. So I feel like this question is just unnecessarily vague and provides too many choices and isn't really specific.
Totally. I think you hit the nail right on the head with that one. So we have a slightly better or more improved version of this question. Again, when are you most likely to attend fundraisers? And then rank your choices in order from most likely to attend, which is number 1, to least likely to attend, number 5. And this question, yeah, Jen, do you want to?
No, I was just going to say that the ranking just makes it so much better. The only thing I've technically come across is that some survey software, and there doesn't seem to be a real consistent pattern of like, is 1 best or is 5 best? And so I know I've technically come across the opportunity where it hasn't worked because the person actually ranked them reverse. I have seen, well, maybe there's a best model that's coming next and I shouldn't spoil anything, but I have seen some where you actually click and drag the things you like and put them into an order that's your preference. And it feels a little bit more interactive than just drop down boxes.
Totally. That's a really good alternative to this ranking. And I think you're right in saying that there isn't a consistent approach to what 1 is and what 5 is. And it's not clear within the answer options here either. You have to kind of go back to the question and reread it to find out what, okay, like yes, 1 is most likely, and then go from there. And then we also don't, in this example, provide any parameters around what the rest of these numbers mean. So, if somebody ranks something at 3 or 4, does that mean that they may come, they may not come? It's still a little bit unclear, and it does give you a top priority, but beyond that, it doesn't go any deeper to give you any more direction. And we do have a best example. This question has now been reworked again to kind of be shown in a matrix scale, where we're able to ask about all the options at the same time. And then here, instead of providing a number scale or a quantitative scale from 1 to 5, we provide some qualitative measures to determine the likeliness of people attending the fundraiser at one of these times. And then with this kind of question style, a clear option will rise to the top based on what people select as their very likely occurrence. And then, you'll also be able to see some of the next most popular options through the somewhat likely column there. So this is a really great way to drill down on a set of options and prioritizing type question.
All right, our next example, and this one is I'm particularly passionate about this example of a question that needs improvement. So do you have any other comments to share? We often see these in draft surveys from our teams at the city as kind of a catch-all at the very end after you've asked all of your questions about whatever your topic is, an open text box that says anything else you want to say. So again, not sure if anything's jumping out at you here, Jen. I'm sure you've heard me talk about this before, but what could be problematic here?
Yeah, somebody who has actually done like sentiment analysis on open-ended text boxes like this, where you have to interpret a person's comments and assign almost like an emotion or assign whether or not their comments are neutral, their comments are irrelevant. Like I've literally had to sit down with a 500 response document, and then me take my bias and my feelings and put it onto what somebody else has commented, and it's exhausting. It doesn't generally solve the problem. One of my biggest issues is that this is usually the last question. So by then I've already given you all the feedback that was the most important, and now you're just asking if I want to follow up. So, I mean, I have a feeling I know what the better and the best options are. So I'll stand back and wait and see. But when I see this, I'm just like, oh, this is a terrible question. Don't ask this.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's when I see this in draft surveys as well, I suggest to teams to take this question out. So in my experience, whenever you ask a question like this as your final question, your kind of catch-all at the end, it is very rare that you will end up with any kind of actionable themes out of what you get from respondents. So you'll see a lot of NAs or none because people think that they have to write something here. That's problematic. But because this is so open, people can kind of talk about anything under the sun, and so really the comments are going to be all over the place, and it's going to be tough to come up with those themes that actually give you some direction or that you can do something with. So absolutely everything you've said here, Jen, is what I've seen in my experience for sure. And yeah, I really appreciate the point about open ends, that you've got individuals who are typing sometimes quickly, and we have to then interpret, like, what are they actually trying to say? There's often typos. We have to kind of read into things a little bit with open-ended, which also makes them tough. And you're not having a conversation with this person if it was like an interview or a workshop or an in-person session where you could say, can I just clarify that I heard you correctly? Do you mean X or Y? We have none of that follow-up. So open ends are tricky for a lot of reasons, but that's another reason why. So we have a better option here. And so we've started with optional in all caps, and you might want to bold this as well so that people know that they don't have to write something here. So we still do get nones and NAs when we use this optional. But do you have any other suggestions about how to best schedule our fundraisers that you haven't already had a chance to share through the survey questions? So this is still an open text question, is still open-ended, but we're really putting some arms around it. Instead of like, what else do you want to say? It's like, do you have anything else that's relevant to the topic of our survey that you haven't already been able to share through the survey questions? So this is a better. I still don't know that this type of question is necessary. And I would encourage in most cases that you don't need a question like this. If your survey design has been good and you've had other opportunities, at least for some open text input through your other survey questions, even if it's just an other, please specify, people have a chance to tell you what they want to tell you. So I don't think that a question like this is necessary, but if you really want to put one in, put some arms around it. Don't have it be so wide open. So we don't have a best option for that one.
Great. Another example. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all effective and 10 being very effective, how would you rate our newsletter? And then it's a multiple choice question with numbers 1 through 10 listed out. And maybe Jen, do you have
how
thoughts?
many problems are there with this? Yeah, I mean, I know that some of again, this kind of is a little bit of a tech gut feeling that I have, is that there are pieces of survey software that allow you to do a much better job of getting someone's sort of ranking or level of effectiveness or grade or whatever sort of thing you want to do, where you move a slider to indicate how satisfied you are. There's also, for me, there's a real problem with the word effective. What does effective mean? That it was sent? Does effective mean it made you buy something? Like, what are you actually what is the effect you're hoping to get? And so I think there's just way too much that's open to interpretation here. And then technically, I think it's also a little challenging because you know, I might not necessarily want to put it as a 1 or 2. And again, by the time I've read through the number choices, I might go, wait, is 1 good or bad? And so again, it's from a technical perspective, it doesn't work. And then also it's a bit of a wishy-washy question.
Yeah. Top student, Jen, you got all the points down. And the only one thing I would add is like a scale of 1 to 10 is so vast. Like there are so many options in between there, and that, you know, can leave room for some subjectivity that you otherwise may want more definite answers and concrete opinions on. So
yeah,
perhaps shrinking your scale is a better approach.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, to be fair, I'm a bit of the choir that you two are preaching to at the moment in terms of surveys, but I do think that these kinds of questions just don't get you an answer that you're looking for. I mean, it could be, are you satisfied or are you not satisfied with the newsletter? Like if that's what you're looking for in the question. So there's just so many easier ways. Plus, this takes up a ton of real estate on a screen. And if somebody is taking this survey, like for example, on a mobile device, they're scrolling to try and find what the number is that they want to rank it. So I think it's, you know, it's just not friendly to your users.
That's such a good point as well. Yeah. So our better example. So we reworked the question here. How would you rate the effectiveness of our monthly email newsletter at informing you what's happening at the organization? So Jen, to your point about what does effective mean here, we've put some arms around it. And now we've given you a qualitative scale of like effectiveness. So it's not up to your interpretation to decide what 5 means or what a 3 means. We've asked you to kind of qualify that number ranking with some adjectives.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a best coming, but I do think that stuff like this is like, we've almost gotten too formal, right? Like, how would you rate the effectiveness of keeping you informed? You know, when really like what you're asking is our monthly email newsletter letting you know what's happening? And that can be a yes/no question. And so I feel like when we put in sort of this very formalized language of how would you rate this, I feel like it kind of asks the user and invites the user to be judge and jury of whether or not you're good at your job. And so I've had some survey takers, when I've put a question like this in on a nonprofit survey, that they don't want to be mean. They don't want to say what they truly think. And so they don't do a good job of putting in options that are sort of more neutral and that don't feel like you're penalizing someone by providing an answer, because, you know, you might have very good feelings about the nonprofit, but you don't want them to think they're not doing a good job. So there's probably an even better way to answer this question, but I don't know, is there a best?
I would rank our best option kind of at par with our better option, but I think it speaks to what you're saying about this question style being very formal. So perhaps this is a more informal approach of ranking, where we use an emoji scale. And so you can change up the qualifiers underneath the images, but you can have people react based on their like emotions as opposed to feelings of effectiveness or whatever your question might be.
Yeah, I love the emoji scale. That's awesome.
Yeah. And again, maybe that helps people feel a little bit less harsh in their critique if that's a concern, and it gives them a little bit more personal options to choose from here.
For sure.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I love the contrast, right? Like these are basically the same question. Here it's a wall of text, and here it's really quick to see. You know, it's fun. It's a little more fun. It's not so text heavy. You can glance at them and, you know, kind of decide what your answer is without having to do too much work. I cut you off. Sorry, Zaria.
Oh, I was going to ask you if you had anything else to add. But
oh, there you go. Yeah, I really appreciate though, Jen, your point about it doesn't need to be this kind of formal language. Let's and I think that speaks to what we were talking about earlier about drilling down your questions about what are we really trying to ask here? Like, what is the feedback that we need from folks? And then, really trying to get clear about that. And then that'll help us to ask our questions in a more clear way too. So then people actually really know what it is they're telling us when they answer as well. So great points.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like there's a lot of opportunity there to just like actually ask a person, like it's a conversation.
Yeah, for sure. So we don't really have, for this last one of kind of example questions, we don't really have a needs improvement, better and best option or great option, but we wanted to talk about demographic questions and just encourage you to use caution here when you ask demographic questions. So again, you know, taking a step back before you start to write your demographic questions or include the ones that you always include in every survey that you do, to kind of step back and say, why are we asking for this information? And what are we going to do with the answers here? So, you know, these are, especially these examples up on the screen about your gender identity and your annual household income, these are really sensitive, you know, and personal questions that we're asking. And I don't know about you, but when I'm responding to surveys, you know, maybe depending on who's asking, I'm inclined to say prefer not to say on these types of questions. That's kind of my default. So I think that just gives us a clue that, you know, we need to take a step back and think about why are we asking this and what are we going to do with it? So for us at the city, we do ask some demographic questions, but we're really strategic about what we ask and how we ask. And we explain to people why we're asking. So our primary purpose at the city when we ask demographic questions is to understand like who we're hearing from in the community and who is actually missing. Like that's the most important thing we're trying to get at, is what perspectives or what demographic groups or voices might be missing from the conversation, which then helps us to do outreach or, you know, targeted communications, relationship building with groups that we know are underrepresented. So we're looking for that trend over time. We're trying to figure out who's missing so that we can then include them in the conversation, be more welcoming, build relationships with those folks and those groups. So really being clear about why you're asking and then explaining to your participants why you're asking and what you're going to do with the results. Something also to be cautious about with questions like this or any demographic questions is if in particular your sample size is quite small or you typically don't get a whole lot of respondents to your survey, you need to start being cautious about, is it really anonymous then? If you're asking some detailed demographic questions and your sample size is quite small, you're maybe going to be able, or your staff who have access to the results might be able to figure out who's answering, and that's tricky. Then it starts to be a privacy consideration. And we also need to think about how are we reporting out if we're asking these questions. So it is a survey best practice to share your results out when your survey is finished. We would encourage you to do that. It probably should have been included in one of our top tips, is to share back the results with your community and your participants. But if you're asking demographic questions, how are you sharing those results? And then what are those privacy considerations if you are sharing those results out?
Yeah, I'd probably add
a lot to dig into here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Jen.
I'd probably add the piece around. I'm glad that you've got these two questions in particular up on the screen. I know at one point I took a survey and they asked my gender identity, and the options were female and male. It was a mandatory question, and I wanted to answer, prefer not to say, and I had no option. I had to answer female or male, and I couldn't move forward in the survey. And it was actually an organization that I was really keen to provide some feedback to. And so I ended up abandoning the survey. And it was one of their qualifiers. It was like one of their first 3 or 4 questions that they asked. And so they didn't get any feedback from me because of how they had set up their survey to not only ask a super binary question, like, are you female or are you male? And not give me an option to say other, not give me an option to say, no, thank you, I'd prefer not to tell you. And also to make it mandatory. I think you're right. If you set it up and you explain, this is why we want this information, this is how it will be used, this is the value of this information to us as an organization, I would have been more likely to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll select, what's appropriate for me. But I really think that it's a challenge, especially when we start talking about gender identity and also when we talk about annual household income. So the other point there I'd probably make is that here in the Lower Mainland of British Columbia, the household income doesn't necessarily line up with the cost of living. And so, just because your household income may be more than $80,000, for example, doesn't mean that you have disposable income, for example. It doesn't mean that you're actually able to do anything. So asking what someone's income in doesn't necessarily reflect their capacity for spending or their capacity for saving. And it doesn't necessarily reflect, you know, the type of person that you want to provide answers to. For example, if it was about poverty or if it was about some sort of initiative to support people who are living in poverty, then it's a different story because you might be cultivating relationships with them. But yeah, so I'm really glad that you put these two particular demographical questions in particular, because those are two that I think have sort of shown themselves to be a little bit problematic if they're not approached with a lot of sensitivity.
Yeah, these types of questions are super tricky to write. You know, the language is kind of always evolving and changing, and so you know it can get really tricky. Another one that's got a lot of potential for pitfalls is you know, ethnic background or cultural background. And so, you know, the safest way to ask those types of questions is to just have people self-identify and have it be an open text. But again, you know, you need to really interrogate, why are we asking this? And, you know, what are we going to do with it? Why is it important to know? So Jen's also raised a couple of other key points of, you know, we usually recommend demographic questions should come at the end of your survey, unless there is that qualifier where you're really not looking for responses unless you belong to a specific group, like you live in New West or you have a connection here. That would go up front. But if you're asking sort of just who are we hearing from and who might be missing type questions, those would go at the end. We typically recommend them at the end. And it's always important to give people a prefer not to say option or make the question optional. So, you know, I think Jen's experience, you would get that quite a bit. If you're forcing people to answer, and we're going to talk about mandatory questions in a moment, if you're forcing people to answer and they can't move on, that's going to frustrate people and they'll drop off your survey, and then you won't get the input that you're looking for. So lots of really good points here. There's a lot to unpack with demographic questions. So, you know, feel like we could do a workshop just on this. But we'll maybe leave it there. But, you know, it is definitely takes a lot of consideration and careful thought. And that key question of, like, why are we asking for this information, and how's it going to change our results? How's it going to influence our results from the survey? Any other points, Zaria, before we move on here?
Just really quickly, I was going to say about in response to Jen's comment about the household income question, is that sometimes that question is so subjective and taken out of context. You don't know how many income earners there are in a household that are responding, that this person is responding on behalf of. They're a single income household or dual, triple. So that response can really mean nothing if it doesn't have that associated kind of marker of how many people or how many incomes are we talking about that make up your household.
Yeah. And then your income question is suddenly 3 or 4 questions. And that's a barrier for folks. That's taking us away from that key principle of keeping it short. So definitely not recommended. We don't actually ask this question at the city unless it's specific to the project for some reason, and that's pretty rare. So. All right, so we do have a few other types of questions or things to avoid in your survey. We're almost getting to the end of our session here, so just a few more tips before we leave you. And the first one is to avoid leading questions. And so a leading question is one where you're introducing your bias in some way, or you know the kind of answer that you're looking for, and so your question is framed in a way to elicit that answer that you're looking for. So an example here would be, if you've made some changes to a service or to a program recently and you want to ask for feedback on that, a way of phrasing that question in a leading way would be, please provide your feedback on the improvements we've made on X or Y. Whereas a more neutral question would be, please provide your feedback on the changes that we've made on X or Y. So improvements is leading people to think, oh, well, this must be better. And it's showing that you believe it's better. But if you're asking for feedback, you really need to be a little more neutral to ask for feedback on the changes that were made instead of improvements.
Next tip, yeah. What else to avoid is jargon and acronyms. If you're using concepts or terms in your question, in your survey design that don't mean anything to anyone else, you run the risk of people not being able to accurately respond to your question. And so we like to tell our colleagues at the city that, if your grandma took this survey, would she understand what you're asking about? Does this term make sense to her or to a smaller child? Or is this a concept that we have to define and build some context into our survey to explain what we're talking about, or put out the long form of whatever an acronym might be, to help build that understanding so people can accurately share their thoughts and feedbacks on that concept.
I have noticed that cities and nonprofits are both very guilty of loving acronyms. And we love to shorten things, and we like to make catchy acronyms as well. A lot of programs and nonprofits end up sort of being based on it. VENN, the program that we are a part of tonight, it stands for Virtual Education and Networking Nights. And while it was really obvious in the very early days because we introduced it that way, we now just refer to it as VENN. And it's taken a little while for me to remember. Not everybody understands that acronym. So I will take this point well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a good reminder for us all. We get so embedded in the lingo of our industry or our organization, and we need to always be putting that hat on of someone who's not part of that inner circle. And will they even understand the words that are coming out of our mouths? And oftentimes the answer is no. So we need to work on plain language. It's an ongoing practice, and something that I think we'll continue to work on in an ongoing way through our careers is communicating in plain language. Something else to avoid is double-barreled questions. So this is putting more than one thing together in a single question when really it should be separate questions. So an example here would be, how would you rate, or what was your satisfaction with the speed of service and the friendliness of our staff? That's putting speed of service and friendliness of staff together in one question when those are two very distinct things. Staff could be fast but not friendly. They could be friendly but not fast. So those are two distinct concepts and should be two separate questions. So removing that problem, we would have a separate question about the speed of service and a separate question about the friendliness of staff. So don't put two things together in one, because then your results really don't mean anything at all.
And our last kind of tip of what to avoid in the survey are mandatory questions. And Jen's given a really great example of why this is problematic. And for those who aren't familiar, in your survey design settings and whatever survey platform you choose to use, there's usually an option to mark this question as mandatory, and that kind of puts a little asterisk next to the question and forces people to select a response or type a response to that question before they're able to advance further on into the survey. And in our experience, we find that this is not necessary, and that people who set out with intentions to respond to the survey most likely than not always answer the questions, or unless there's like a specific reason or they don't have a response, in which case they'll move past that one particular question. But without making questions mandatory, we still seem to get a very high response rate and completion rate from surveys. And then, yes, if you do make a question mandatory that someone feels forced to answer, you run the risk of frustrating them and then having them, like Jen did, drop out of the survey and not collect their feedback and not give them the opportunity to further share their input with you. So if, wherever possible, make your questions non-mandatory, and then people can self-select to answer and continue on the survey as they feel they need to or they would like to.
So as our parting thought, we have just a set of questions here to ask yourself, and whoever you're working with on your survey. So we suggested you work with at least one other person on your survey design, and we would suggest really working through these questions for each of the questions in your survey design. So you've got your draft, or you're drafting some questions, to go through each question and ask yourself these key questions. So is this question necessary? And does it connect up with our objectives? Is it clearly something we said we wanted to get out of this survey when we talked about what are we trying to achieve before we even started drafting questions? Is the wording clear, concise, and in plain language? So again, would someone who's not close to our industry understand what we're asking here and be able to answer? Have we included enough context and information for participants to meaningfully respond? So is there anything missing here that we need to maybe include before someone is able to answer the question? What kind of data will responses to this question generate? So like, again, taking a step back from this question and thinking, okay, well, so what kind of results are we going to get here? And is it going to be able to apply in the ways that we want it to? What will we do with the results for this question in particular? So thinking about, okay, so this data set we're going to get out of here, we're going to get a ranked list of times people will come to our fundraiser. How are we then going to apply that to our decision making or to our programming? So really being clear on that question is really the key thing that we need to get to help us find our way forward as an organization. So our final,
I appreciate the pugs.
yes, any final questions or thoughts or comments as we wrap up?
Yeah, I've got one question around survey fatigue. So an organization that I've volunteered with in the past like to do an annual member survey just to validate their strategic plan and just to sort of check in. The survey itself, I recall being quite lightweight and well written, but I felt like I was getting one like every 2 months. And it got to the point where I was being asked to provide feedback. I thought more than I had anticipated I would be providing feedback. So just maybe if either of you have any thoughts around sort of the frequency of sort of how often we should be asking for feedback.
Great question. Zaria, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, it seems every couple of months to be a little bit too frequent for my personal preference. And with such a short turnaround like that, perhaps there's an opportunity to combine and condense surveys and, have different sections within a survey if they're asking about different things, to not overburden folks with, your repeated asks and them feeling burdened to provide you with their feedback so frequently. I don't know if there's like a sweet spot on what that number should look like from a quantifiable perspective, but for me, 2 months feels a little bit too frequent.
Yeah, it definitely felt too frequent, and I felt like the questions were too similar, so that what happened is the next time they asked me, I deleted the email. And so I felt like, I was comfortable at the pace of an annual member feedback survey. That sounds great. I'd love to give you feedback about the things I did with you during this past year. They were smart in that they used to combine it with a plea for donations. So it was, give us feedback, and if you're happy, give us some money. So I always felt that was very wise for them to kind of use that route. But then when it was like, oh, but we just want to check in on this, and we just want to check in on this, and I was like, isn't that why you're running the organization and I'm just a member? Like, it sort of started feeling too onerous, and what it meant is that I disengaged a bit. Like, it's like sending a newsletter too frequently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, from the organization's perspective, I would be surprised if they were actioning that survey every time they were asking, right? So it's, again, coming back to that question of what are you going to do with what you hear? And if the answer is nothing, then you really need to take a second look at why are you surveying right now? Why are you asking right now? And is there a better time? Or is there, maybe that interval needs to be less frequent. We need to be ready to do something with what we're hearing back. And if it's just a check-in, pick up the phone a few folks who are, key supporters or who you haven't heard from in a while, and just check in with them and see, is everything cool with us right now? Like, do you have any feedback about your activities with us lately? Do some of those, like, phone check-ins or interviews, and it doesn't need to be formal, right? Like, just pick up the phone and call a few people if you're just wanting to take the temperature a little bit.
And I do think the social polls that you mentioned are also a really valid way to do something like that. Is, did you like this event? Yes, no. You know, would you like to see more of these events? Yes, no. So I feel like those social polls and the interviews, which can be super informal, I think those are really, really good tips for an organization that's a little bit maybe too married to the survey software to really get meaningful feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to be part of an organization that was sending like a monthly member feedback survey, and every time they were really long as well. And I was just like, again, I stopped taking them because I was like, I don't see how this is being used. It just, you know, that other thing is you need to demonstrate. Like if you're asking, then you know, it's a great idea to say, hey, we asked you this is what you said, and now here's what we're doing with it. That helps people to feel like it's not a waste of time for them to be filling out your survey as well.
I feel like I must have paid you for that segue, because that leads very nicely into my other question that I had for you. So in terms of closing the loop and providing the information back to the, you know, the community or the group that you've asked for feedback from, how kind of in depth should we get? Is this just like a what we heard couple of bullets, or is this like, here's the raw data, make your own analysis? Or is there something in the middle?
I think it depends on what you're asking and what your capacity is as a team to develop that kind of report. We've internally, between Jennifer and I, kind of created all of the above, all those kind of options. I think particularly for quantitative data, things that have like, you can parse in terms of like percents or show in graphs, having that visual accompaniment to demonstrate what the results for a type of question like that are like really handy tools to use, and that can help you know, condense the amount of text wall that you would have in a report. And then for like qualitative data, we like to do kind of a theming and analysis and show what would be like a key themes from this question were, and then provide a few bullet points. Something that we've recently started doing that I think has been quite useful is that an infographic summary, where we kind of pull out the key stats from a survey and show that in a visual way, either with like some charts or some colorful icons, and have that be a really accessible, quick and easy one-pager kind of results highlights sheet.
Yeah, I think that reporting back piece definitely can feel like a barrier when you're hosting a survey, and it feels like an extra step and a lot of work, but it's really important, and I don't think it has to be super involved, right? So you know, even if it is just a couple of bullet points in your next newsletter, or you know, pulling out one of those graphs from a key result, it just shows people that you are listening. It really demonstrates that, you know, you're grateful for the feedback, that it's not just going into you know, a black hole where nothing's happening with it. It's like even just sharing back, hey, we heard you. If you can go that extra step and say, now here's what we've done with it, even better. But you know, even if it's just a couple of bullet points, that's better than nothing when it comes to closing the loop and reporting back. So yeah, encourage it highly.
And if you know, like the resources and time that go into creating like a report or reporting out seem a little daunting, like there's a lot of platforms now have a quick and easy report out option where they generate like a survey summary, and that can be a really, you know, low barrier way to share some feedback quickly with your respondents and with your community.
When it comes to sharing the raw data, I mean, we do that as, you know, as a demonstration of transparency at the city, but I think for a nonprofit, it's probably not necessary unless, you know, someone's asked for it and you're okay to share that. We typically review it for any personal information, so we want to protect people's privacy before we release it. But, you know, I would say if that's all you're doing, that kind of puts the onus on your community or your participants to sort of figure out, what did you hear? So if you are going to release the raw data, I would say you want to at least provide a bit of a summary, even if it is just a few bullet points or like a graph here or there, so that the work doesn't end up on your participants' shoulders to kind of parse what the results were.
Yep. So the last question I have, all three of us have mentioned different platforms and reference what different platforms offer. Off the top of your head, do you have any particular tools that you would suggest a person looks into if they're looking for surveying software or surveying capabilities? I know the city uses Be Heard, which is a fairly fulsome platform that does more than just surveying. But for someone who's looking for a simple option, any ideas?
I think there's, the most popular Google Forms and SurveyMonkey. But I would just caution and like double check what the privacy and where the servers are located for those types of platforms, and if that aligns with, I guess, privacy laws in your own organization's best practices. But those are, I think the most popular, in my opinion, that I've seen used most frequently.
Absolutely. So yeah, for us in working in local government, where the data is stored is important, and there's regulations around that for us. I don't think the same thing applies for nonprofit organizations, but it's something to look into. If you are looking for just a basic survey platform that does have data hosted in Canada, Simple Survey is a option to look into. I don't think that they have an entirely free option, but I think they have some low cost subscription options. So that's something to look into if hosted in Canada data is important for your organization.
I have also seen a few organizations recently that are using SharePoint. SharePoint has some sort of form-based functionality depending upon what your platform is. So depending upon if your organization is using, SharePoint and Microsoft products as their sort of platform that the organizations run on, there are some options within SharePoint to do that. I have used Google Forms with some success. One of the nice parts of Google Forms is that it immediately ports it into Excel data. However, when we look at those nice pie charts and nice graphs that are created, somebody still has to create those. So sometimes it does pay. And then the other piece the tip that I would probably suggest is to look at an organization like TechSoup, which often provides low cost or even lower cost and sometimes free software options for nonprofits. So, if Simple Survey is a good choice, I don't know if they're on TechSoup, but it's definitely worth taking a look to see if there's any offerings for nonprofit providers that can use that.
A good tip.
Well, I think that's probably everything. So I want to thank you both so much for your time. It's lovely to be able to do one of these sessions with my colleagues. So I really appreciate your time. This will be posted online shortly. And if anyone who is watching has feedback that they would like to provide me, they don't have to fill out a survey. You are welcome to simply email me. It's jarbo@newascity.ca, and I'd be happy to take any of your feedback, whether it's an idea for a future session or whether you have any feedback from this particular one at all. So thank you again, Jennifer and Zaria.
Pleasure.